Those ships won't be going, and you're talking about 500, 600, 700 million dollars a day. It's a lot of money, a lot of money. That's why the world is okay. It's liquid, it's fine. Also, we run out of reserves in about 4 weeks. You know, there are reserves all over the world, and we would really run out. And there'll be a time when you wouldn't be able to get it. And you want to see Bedlam?
Well, that's it, folks. You want to see Bedlam? Just got to wait 4 weeks. You see Marco Rubio's face when he said that? You have to check around the room to see if anyone else noticed. I could get into talking about the strategic mistake that is of saying that out loud and letting the people we're negotiating with know that we're going to be out of oil in about 4 weeks, but maybe that's a different video. I mean, saying that out loud basically takes away any bargaining chip we had. But this brings up a really interesting point. What happens if we actually do run out of oil? So this rumination is going to be on what exactly happens if or when the strategic oil reserves run out. And watch the end, because after doing some serious rumination on this, I've come to the conclusion that the stakes are extremely high. And the consequences and effects of that happening are going to happen really, really quick. Now, as I'm recording this, the status of the deal is changing hour by hour. You have the president making claims about the progress, and then you got word from Iran that they're not really seeing things quite the same way. But for now, it looks like we're out of options, and this thing absolutely has to go through because the alternative is pretty bleak. About a fifth of the oil that the world burns through in a day goes through this strait. It's a narrow body of water between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. At its tightest point, it's only a few miles across. Like I said, 20% of the world's daily oil consumption is going through a body of water that you can see straight across. This makes it extremely easy to shut down. All Iran needs is a couple of cheap drones, and they can take out a ship. Nobody's going to risk that, and no insurance company is going to insure a ship to go through that. Now, this is not a new thing. This has been a concern for a while. After the 1973 oil embargo, when the Arab states cut off oil, the U.S. had gas lines that stretched around the block. In response to that, the U.S. creates the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which is hundreds of millions of barrels of crude oil held in underground salt caverns around the Gulf of Mexico, or maybe the Gulf of America. The idea was that if our oil supply gets choked off again, we'd have a buffer to ride it out. Now, at the start of the war, we had about 400 million barrels. Today, we have 330 million. That's the lowest point since the 80s. The U.S. burns through about 20 million barrels of oil a day, and we currently have, like I said, 330 million. But also the U.S. produces about 13.7 million barrels a day. So 2/3 is what we generate ourselves. The rest comes basically from Canada, and about 8% goes through the strait that we get from the Middle East. The thing is, we're exporting way more oil now to make up for the global shortage, not just our own. Before the war, we were exporting a little over 6 million barrels a day, and now that number is up to about 11 million. So between that and the 500,000 barrels we were importing from the Middle East, and the increase in what we have to export to bolster the global economy, that's about 6.5 million barrels a day being drawn from the reserves. And you can't draw the reserves down to zero. You have to leave about 10% in there because, like I said, they're in salt caverns underground. And I don't know, you need some amount of oil in there to maintain their structural integrity. So Trump's math is right. There's about 4 weeks before we're out, if, and that's the key word, if the strait remains closed. So let's say this thing, just for shits and giggles, it goes south, goes the wrong way, the strait stays locked down. What does running out of that oil actually look like? Not on a chart, but at the actual gas pump, at the grocery store, at the kitchen table. Well, the first thing is the price shock, because gas is bouncing around $80 to $90 a barrel, and that's just from the fear of what's going to happen. So you take a fifth of the world's oil supply off the table, for real, with no reserves backing it up, you're talking about sending oil up way over $100 a barrel, and that's going to happen really fast. And oil isn't like other things. You can't just buy less of it when it gets expensive. You still got to get to work. Goods still have to be moved around the country. So, and price isn't just going to gradually get more expensive. It's going to spike. It's going to be overnight, like you've never seen it spike before. Today in the U.S., the cost of a gallon of gas is about $4. I think it just slipped below the $4 level. And if and when the reserves run out, you're looking at the mid sixes. And in some parts of the country, that would touch $10 a gallon. I'm looking at you, California, but that's just the gas that you're putting in your car. The real problem is the diesel. Diesel is basically the lifeblood of the economy. Every truck that brings food to your grocery store, brings all that crap to Walmart, every train, every ship, every tractor, they all run on diesel. When diesel spikes, it's not just the truckers who are paying more. Everything a truck has ever carried, which is everything, food, medicine, construction materials, clothes, they all go up in price. Shortages start to happen and shelves go empty, not because the goods aren't there, it's because it's too expensive to move them. And the key basics that we need, like food and medicine, they're going to skyrocket in price. Which leads us to the next thing, which is inflation. It's been creeping around the fringes for the last few months, but if the strait stays closed, it's busting through the wall bigger and badder than ever. This causes the economy to stall, and then you get stagflation. Stagflation is when you have slow growth, which would result from everything being so expensive and high unemployment. So when businesses are hit with a shock like an oil shortage and prices soar, everything goes up. But most people can't afford to buy, so revenue goes down. Businesses are forced to raise retail prices, but consumers can't afford to pay those prices. Then businesses start losing money and they have to start laying people off because they can't afford to keep them. As unemployment goes up, the Fed lowers interest rates. In normal times, lowering interest rates means cheaper borrowing, which goes to building and expanding businesses. But in this scenario, it's used to basically buy the same scarce goods, which just supercharges inflation. There's really only two ways to get out of stagflation: a severe engineered recession to break inflation, or some sort of technological boom to restore economic growth. So we basically have two paths. There's the Volcker shock, which was used by Fed Chair Paul Volcker in the 70s by raising interest rates to unprecedented highs. By making borrowing so expensive, it freezes the consumer spending and business investments. It intentionally triggers a recession and pushes unemployment way up. Once people start to lose the ability to spend, businesses are forced to lower prices. Only when inflation is completely dead can the Fed lower rates again and allow the economy to slowly heal. This is going to translate into gas lines, rationing, people losing homes, losing everything. People are going to have a hard time affording food and the bare necessities. So all you millennials out there, we got another thing to add to our resume. Yeah, high school was 9/11 and the war on terror. College and early career was the Great Recession. Then the COVID pandemic throws down on you harder than a sack of shit. And once you get your bearings from that, you have the great Trump-Israel-Iran recession. It just keeps getting better and better. So now there is one other way to get out of stagflation, and that's fixing the supply chain problem. Fast-tracking oil production, building pipelines, lowering corporate taxes to make things cheaper to produce and sell. All these things take time, though, and that's what the strategic oil reserves were supposed to do. So we find ourselves in this weird game of chicken because there's enough hope that we can just decide to leave and say we don't care anymore and have things go back to normal. So nobody really has the will to start lowering taxes and building pipelines. If this was a war that people believed in and thought we were doing the right thing, we might have started doing a lot of these things beforehand. Now, I know there are some people out there who think that this is a typical Trump is crazy like a fox scenario because he took out Maduro and now Venezuela's oil is basically under our control. It seems like a really good 3D chess move. Before invading Iran and creating this problem, he basically was able to get a hold of Venezuela's oil. Problem is, Venezuela doesn't really produce that much oil. Under Maduro, they were exporting about 600,000 barrels a day, and now that number is up to actually about 1.2 million. Now, given the U.S. uses 20 million barrels a day, that's not going to make up for the shortfall. Even in a decade-long timeline, Venezuela could probably only up that to about 3 million barrels a day. And I know that there's another offshoot of this argument of Trump being crazy like a fox, people saying that in the beginning of the war, this was kind of a great idea because it's going to weaken China more than it's going to weaken us. The reality is that China is actually stronger now than it was before the war. It's in a better position, actually, to dictate global oil prices. You see, at the start, China had its state-run and independent refineries process their own corporate inventories. It turns out China spent all of 2025 hoarding cheap crude, so their commercial tanks were brimming and had enough oil to keep the refineries going without creating a national emergency. So their own strategic reserve of 1.4 billion barrels isn't even touched. They also put a ban on all refined fuel exports. Now, you add to that fact that their electric vehicles have cut their daily oil consumption by about 1 million barrels a day. And by 2030, it'll shave another 2 million barrels a day off too. So China's got plenty of oil. It's in a great position. And now you basically not only have Iran leaving this thing stronger than they were before the war, but you also have China leaving this thing stronger than they were before. So if the strait doesn't open and our reserves deplete, it would effectively mark the end of the U.S.-led global economy and kind of refocus it on China. The U.S.'s status as the world's reserve currency is largely because oil is traded in dollars. If the U.S. can't backstop its allies, China could use their massive energy cushion to dictate terms. China could potentially mandate that any oil trading through its network would have to be settled in yuan, effectively breaking the petrodollar and causing a massive devaluation in the U.S. dollar. So as U.S. fuel prices soar past $7 in this scenario, under a permanent blockade, the Fed would be forced to increase interest rates to extremely unprecedented high levels. They'd be doing that to fight the hyperinflation resulting from a massive economic contraction that would allow China, who's less oil dependent than we are, to eclipse the U.S. as the largest economy in the world decades ahead of schedule. Since the U.S. can't fulfill its obligations under the International Energy Agency to help allies during the emergency, European and Asian powers like Japan and South Korea would face immediate collapse. Historic American allies would be forced to break ranks with Washington and cut new diplomatic deals with Beijing to gain access to China's oil supply. And then you have the potential overland axis power. The U.S. global projection of power basically historically has been the U.S. Navy's ability to blockade oceanic checkpoints. But you don't need that with a Eurasian fortress. So China, Russia, Iran, and Central Asia can potentially form this unbreakable energy trade alliance connected over land by pipelines and railways and beyond the reach of Western military intervention. Because China controls 80% of the world's solar supply chain, electric battery manufacturing, and critical mineral processing, a permanent oil crisis would make the rest of the world dependent on Chinese technology to transition away from fossil fuels. While the West would be trapped in this devastating cycle of high oil prices and slow economic growth, China's electrified transportation sector would basically shield its domestic industry. Beijing would effectively control both the remaining fossil fuel market and the entirety of the alternative energy market. Now, I will say that this is the worst case scenario, and there are a lot of factors in play. This outcome is a lot more realistic, though, than it was 6 months ago. You got the America Second crowd pushing to keep this war going, and they don't really care about this country or its people. So right now, the options are one, we make a deal with Iran and we get that strait opened up, and that's going to be tough with the America Second crowd that's calling for basically a drawn-out ground war fought on behalf of another country that already said it's unwilling to commit their own troops to. Honestly, it's mind-boggling that anyone's still supporting the idea of a prolonged ground war in Iran. Given the results and what's on the table here, what's at risk? Not only lives and years of war, but an immediate recession that might take a generation to recover from. It's absolutely fucking mind-boggling. You honestly have to hate this country and its people if that's your position given the consequences. The other option is we engineer a recession and jack up interest rates. That's terrible too, but at least we won't be dumping billions into a foreign war and putting the lives of American soldiers at risk. And then we could also slash taxes to start a desperate campaign to drill anywhere we possibly can, but that's going to take time and it's going to hurt. Now, not to be too much of a downer, but given our national debt, our population's individual debts, the fact that 53% of Americans can't handle a $1,000 surprise emergency, a recession of this magnitude is something that maybe we wouldn't be able to recover from. And this is where we find ourselves, caught between a rock and a hard place. There are no good answers here, no good outcomes. The least bad outcome is just kind of accepting defeat and walking away from a war that we should have never been involved with in the first place. But right now, getting this deal done, it might be the most consequential decision that's been made since, I don't know, probably the Civil War. Because even America didn't even have this much on the line with World War I and II. Again, I gave you the worst case scenario here, but the worst case scenario is actually pretty realistic. And like I said, the least bad outcome is just to walk away, get that deal done, and open up that strait. And tell anybody else who wants to contest war and put American troops on Iranian soil, tell them to go fuck themselves, because they don't give a shit about this country. They're disgusting, traitorous pieces of crap. So yeah, that's what happens when the Strait of Hormuz remains shut and we run out of oil. So let me know what you think in the comments, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe.